So thank you so much for that introduction again, Michelle. Today I'm excited to share about a project that myself and our consortium director, Rebecca Irwin at North Carolina State University are leading, called a coordinated effort for evaluation of insect pollinators, climate change vulnerability in the Southeast and US Caribbean. All right, let me just move this. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us again. I want to start by giving some context for the inspiration behind this project. So when we look at the growing body of evidence pointing to dramatic global declines in insect populations, a phenomenon some have called the insect apocalypse, land use change is largely attributed as the major cause. However, recent research is finding that climate change may be a more considerable threat than previously thought. From bees and butterflies to beetles and moths, these declines are not only alarming for biodiversity, but also for the ecosystems that depend on insects. So amid this backdrop, understanding how climate change is affecting insects is more critical than ever. Pollinators provide vital benefits to plants, wildlife, and people. Their pollination services keep plants and animals thriving while bringing us food security and supporting the economy. Insect pollinators of North America and their services are predicted to be severely negatively impacted by climate change. Conserving our nation's insect pollinators and their habitat is key to conserving our lands and waters and providing all Americans with access to nature and its many benefits. However, in general, pollinators and other insects, though the largest and most diverse animal group, remain highly understudied in regards to their ecology, status, and vulnerability to threats. There is an amazing amount of pollinator researchers and research happening across the country. However, there have been disproportionate efforts to assess climate change impacts on insect pollinators in the northern and western parts of the continent compared to the Southeast and US Caribbean, even despite a large diversity of endemic native flowering plants throughout the region. Additionally, the little research that has assessed climate threats on Southeast pollinator species have found negative impacts, like this recent study by Cornelis and colleagues that looked at extinction risks of North American pollinators and found the highest number of species to be threatened by climate change, with the most at-risk species also being concentrated in the southern US. Pollinators are critically important for conserving native plant biodiversity, with over 80% of flowering species requiring insects or other animals for pollination. While a diversity of animals can act as pollinators, bees are numerically and functionally the most important pollinator group, with an estimated 20,000 species of bees worldwide, over 6,000 in North America, and over 1,000 in the Southeast alone. When we think about bees, most of us think of honeybees or bumblebees, but roughly 32% of the more than 5,000 bee species native to the country alone are what we call pollen specialists. This means that there are many species of bees which are so adapted to their environments that they only collect pollen from specific plant species or closely related groups of flowers. So another way of saying this is that specialist bees need specific pollen. An example breakdown of a specialist bee community is illustrated by this pie chart, which summarizes the diets of 85 species of specialist bees in the Mid-Atlantic region. So this pie chart is showing what proportion of those bees are specialized on each plant family, with the most popular plant family for specialists being the Asteraceae, so things like sunflowers, Joe pieweed, and goldenrod. The Ericaceae, especially wild blueberries, host a number of specialist bees, followed by willows, and so on. The bee fauna of the US Caribbean, on the other hand, is comprised of many endemics to the specific islands or multiple islands that pollinate a wide variety of native plants there. These species have not been formally assessed or synthesized for effective management action. And so why are we focusing on completing assessments for this project? Well, wildlife and resource managers use species assessments to help them make decisions about planning and conservation priorities. Managers in the Southeast voiced that they want to protect native pollinators, but are unsure how to incorporate and manage for specific species within their conservation goals. And so tailored information is needed on specific at-risk pollinator species and to be able to inform research gaps. So therefore, our overall project objectives are to identify Southeast specialist bees as well as US Caribbean bees for assessment based on partner input. Then to synthesize their distributional data, natural history information, and literature for each species, to conduct conservation status and climate change vulnerability assessments for the bee species identified, to review the assessments collectively and vote on final rankings, and finally to create and disseminate practitioner guide, which the format and content will be determined by our project advisory committee. So this infographic shows the different phases for this project's process. Over the last year, you will see we have completed phase 1 of the project, which involved assembling both a project advisory committee, which is comprised of southeastern state, territory, and tribal wildlife agency partners, as well as a technical team made up of bee experts that will be helping us conduct these assessments. And those are comprised largely of government scientists and academic researchers. We are now partway through phase 2, which I will describe a bit more in depth on the next slide. So this is the kind of where we're at in phase 2. So we have just finished co-creating a list of what species to assess. And what this looked like was we first created a checklist of specialist bees for the Southeast region, which was around 250 species, as well as the total number of native bee fauna for the US Caribbean, which is around 30 species. We then filtered and divided those species lists into 2 categories: data deficient, which have very few observations or haven't been observed for some time, and then those with enough information to assess, and ended up with about 125 bees that could be assessed. So then we gave this list to our project advisory committee. And so if you remember, those folks are largely made up of state, territory, and tribal wildlife agencies, and they were able to actually take this list and crosswalk it with their internal databases and tell us if there were any species that they were also prioritizing or had flagged for conservation need, or fit in with cultural significance as well. So plants that the bees pollinated that were of high cultural significance. So then after incorporating all of their feedback, we have been able to narrow down a more manageable list of species to assess that is at 75 right now. And so I won't put up, all the species names on this list, but I did think it would be fun to break down what we have landed on. And so for the southeastern specialist bees, the majority of critters on the list are mining bees, coming in at 22, followed by carpenter or other apidae species, then plasterer bees, sweat bees, a good number of leaf cutter bees, and then a couple oil bees. For the US Caribbean, the native bee fauna there is comprised of as well a lot of apidae species, followed by sweat bees and leaf cutter bees. And so just to highlight a couple of the species that have come out as flagged being needing assessments, one of the species we will be assessing is a mining bee called Andrena distans, or the cranesbill miner bee, and its host plant is wild geranium. And so this species emerges in the spring when wild geranium is blooming throughout the deciduous woodlands across the whole eastern half of the country. And it specifically only pollinates this flower. And so once the flower is done blooming, the bee is done collecting pollen. So its adult lifespan is actually very short. It's only an adult during the time this flower is blooming. Another species we've identified for assessment is called Osmia calamintha. And this bee, its common name is the blue calamintha bee, which is a Florida endemic species only known from sandy scrub habitat and pollinates only one plant called Ash's calamintha. So now I'll detail our methods for the upcoming assessments that we'll be conducting with the technical team. So in order to produce both range maps and calculate metrics based on these different bees distributions, we've needed to collect a lot of their occurrence or specimen record data. So thankfully, there is a good amount of digitized records that are coming from both Cheshire et al., which is a comprehensive bee database that combines records from both GBIF and SCAN databases, as well as the Florida State Collection of Arthropods, which is hosted on a database called Ecdysis. In addition, though, in the Southeast, there are a large number of undigitized collections, which means that they are not hosted online or haven't been put online yet. And so we've actually reached out to many different universities' insect collections throughout the Southeast, as well as individual bee or academic bee research labs to collate all of those records for the species that we'll be assessing. So the two different types of assessments we're going to use for this project have both been developed by NatureServe. So these include conservation status assessments, as well as climate change vulnerability index. So these status assessments, it's basically a rank calculator system that's used to evaluate a species status by combining rarity factors and threat factors adjusted for each species population trends or occurrence records. And so key rarity metrics, things like population size, the area of occupancy, and ecological integrity are prioritized over the number of occurrences. And short-term trends are weighted more heavily than long-term trends in order to produce a final conservation rank. The Climate Change Vulnerability Index is also a scoring system that integrates a species exposure to projected climate change within an assessment area, and also including consideration of sea level rise where applicable, and 3 sets of factors associated with a species' adaptive capacity. And I'll talk a bit more about that on the next slide. But both of these assessment types were chosen because they are exclusively used by states and territories' natural heritage programs across the country, and are also very popular with state wildlife agencies for prioritizing species for conservation action. So just a bit more about this Climate Change Vulnerability Index. I mentioned it applies information on species traits, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And just a visual for what all goes into adaptive capacity is shown here from this figure from Thurman and colleagues from 2020. And so adaptive capacity involves things like each species distribution, demography, dispersal and movement, life history, evolutionary potential. And basically, when someone is conducting one of these assessments, you input all this information about a species biology, distribution, and ecology. And it helps to identify why species are vulnerable to climate change based on these traits. And then the output is that it provides information for practitioners based on each species' unique biology in order to make informed management decisions. And so I'll show you an example of the results from a draft assessment that our technical team will be producing. This example I produced for a Southeast specialist bee. And this species is a rare dietary specialist dependent on native tick seeds or Coreopsis species within tallgrass prairie ecosystems throughout its range. The suitable habitat within the range of this species is made up of habitat fragments of varying size. And so its dietary specialism has been linked to a higher risk of extinction due to habitat availability under climate change scenarios. Additionally, members of this bee genus exhibit low reproductive output due to their very short adult lifespan, like we heard before. That other bee species I mentioned a few slides back is also a member of this genus, and their adults are very short-lived. And though the host plant of this bee species we can see from the range map in green does exist outside of the range of the bee, which is in blue, members of this genus don't disperse very far, and also due to their short lifespans are unlikely to disperse through unsuitable habitat. And so after inputting all of the biology and ecology data for this species into the two different types of assessments, the draft output for its rankings are that the status rank landed at G2, G3, which means the species is somewhere in between being ranked as vulnerable to imperiled. Through the climate change vulnerability index, we found that this bee has a low adaptive capacity due to a lot of the biology aspects that I mentioned. And so therefore, under both a low and a high climate emission scenario, this bee is projected to be highly vulnerable to climate change throughout its range. And then the draft results for one Caribbean species comes from the greater Antillean carpenter bee, which is an abundant and widespread generalist bee that occurs throughout many Caribbean islands. It pollinates many different flowers, including some economically important crops like coffee and passion fruit. Carpenter bees nest in wood, and this bee exclusively or especially nests in dead branches of trees. And the vast majority of occurrences come from Caribbean islands, which have high exposure to climate change and high indirect exposure through sea level rise. And so the draft results for this species, because it's a generalist bee that feeds on many flowers and has lots of occurrence records, the conservation status rank says that it's apparently secure, but when we look at its exposure and vulnerability to climate change, even though it has a high adaptive capacity, the calculator still ranks it as being moderately to highly vulnerable based on which emission scenario we look at. So that is an overview of kind of where we are right now in the project and what results, what kind of information we're hoping to get for each species. Like I mentioned earlier, the technical team has just been formed, and we're kicking off training with them on these assessments in January. And so we hope to have assessments underway for all of these species and wrapping up by the end of spring. And then what's pretty typical with these kind of assessments is that they are reviewed and verified by experts. So one expert is conducting these draft assessments, but then we will collectively review them and make our own or provide input so that there can be kind of a vetted final ranking for each species. And so we plan to do this collective voting with our partners by hosting a workshop either in late spring or summer of next year. And so that is all I have for today, but I would love to thank my collaborators with the USGS Native Bee Lab, the Southeast Climate Hub, NatureServe, and the Agricultural Research Service with the USDA, and my co-PI, Becky Irwin. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Haley. We have questions flying into the Q&A at the moment, and I'll encourage you folks, if you have any questions or thoughts or comments, feel free to throw those into the Q&A too. So I'll start off, Haley, with the top one. Kara, sorry if I'm mispronouncing it. I'm gonna go with Kara. asked if the Southeast ecoregions map is one that can be shared. That was earlier on in your presentation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Let me just go back to that slide for everyone's, or never mind. But yes, I see we stopped screen sharing. The Southeast ecoregion slide I had up there, that is actually a layer in ArcGIS. Those are EPA ecoregions. And so that is a publicly available layer that you should be able to find if you have access to the online database in ArcGIS. And I'm pretty sure it's just called EPA Level 3 ecoregions. And that map I had made for a poster presentation earlier about this project because ecoregions are one of the ways that wildlife managers kind of do their conservation planning for their different habitats throughout the state. And having management actions that are organized by ecoregions seems like a pretty popular approach. And I just made that graphic to kind of insinuate that, but something to be determined by the actual project advisory committee, how our resulting information will be laid out for managers. Yeah.
Thanks, Haley. And we have a thank you in the chat for there. Thank you so much. Next question came from Wayne. Yes, I'm not aware of those vulnerability related traits being widely available. Considerable, considerable missingness for a wide set of species. Were you only determining vulnerability for a subset of species?
Yes, Wayne, that's a good question. And that's why for the first phase of the project was coming up with a list of species that we did think have enough information. And I worked closely with the USGS Native Bee Lab as well as the Agricultural Research Service to kind of verify this list, this subsetted list of species we think we would have enough information for to assess. You are absolutely right, though, for a lot of these specialist bees, there's not necessarily super detailed information about each individual species' unique biology, but there is a lot of information more at the genus level or that can be applied. And so a lot of the assessments are also using what information is available for closely related members of a species.
Awesome. Thanks, Haley. Thanks, Wayne.
Yeah.
Ellison, you've got two questions that are kind of related. So I'm going to start with the second one. Ellison was asking, are those species lists available somewhere?
So we plan to publish the list, absolutely. And so they will be publicly available. The source we initially started with actually, before we did our own filtering and vetting from our advisory committee here, I was on one of my slides and I will drop
Yeah,
it
you
in the
are
chat.
sharing. Yeah, I can still see your screen,
Oh, you
Haley.
can still
So
see my screen? I'm so sorry.
no, no worries.
Okay, I have too many monitors. Let me go back to this slide then, if I can still control it. Let's see. Okay. So sorry. I'm having a lag. Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing because I'm not finding. I'm going to put it in the chat. We started with their arch species checklists of pollen specialist bees for both the South Central and Southeast US that are public. And those are published by Jared Fowler on his website. And the Southeast one was co-produced by Sam Droege, who's with the USGS Native Bee Lab. And so Sam and Catherine from the USDA helped me kind of crosswalk those lists to come up with a unique, Jared's lists are for the Eastern US and then the South Central US. So we crosswalked them to create a list for the Southeast specifically, and that we do plan to publish. But these are the lists checklists that we initiated our kind of work from.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Haley. Related, there's some questions here about who made the list. So one is, are generalist bee species with conservation concern part of the vulnerable species list for the Southeast?
No. So we for especially doing these type of assessments, there's so many bee species in the Southeast. Like I mentioned on that one of my intro slides, there's over 1,000 bees in the Southeast alone is estimated. And
Mm.
so we tried to identify pollen specialists because there's several theories that species who are more limited by their diet breath will be more vulnerable to threats like climate change if there's host mismatch or changes in distribution of those plants that they rely on. So honestly, just for workload reasons, we decided to narrow the project by working on assessing specialist bees to begin with. Now, for the Caribbean, though, a lot of those are not specialists. And so for the Caribbean species, like the example I showed, those are generalist bees. And so for the Caribbean, it's more of a unique situation where we're just trying to synthesize the bee fauna that does exist there. I think I said there's about 30 native bee species to the US Caribbean. So, yeah,
Thanks, Haley.
good question.
And then Rua asks another question about who made the list. I'm going to get this right. Is spring beauty minor bee? I'm not going to attempt the Latin there. Is that also on the assessment list? It has a very similar ecology habitat to the cranesbill minor bee. The plant they depend on takes much longer to grow to flower, so could be even more vulnerable.
That's a great question. I have my list up right here, so let me check, Rua. It is on the list. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. And
Made the cut.
yeah, it did make the cut.
Awesome. Great. And then more questions about the list accessibility. And as Haley mentioned, that'll be out there when they're ready to get that published. And you can guarantee that we will send it across to folks who are interested in these things too. Robert, I'm not going to attempt the Latin. Haley, how about maybe I will.
That specific bee.
This specific bee. Um,
um, yes, that bee is also on our list.
Excellent.
I guess I should have put up a species list for you all.
Well, awesome, folks. Haley, again, thank you so much for your time. It's a really exciting project. I know it will answer quite a lot of questions and help fill in some of those gaps. So thank you so much for doing that and taking it on. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen one more time just to give us a wrap up here. There we are. Okay, great. All right, folks. So normally at this point at the seminar, I announce who the next seminar is going to be. We're putting that together for January still, but it will be lightning talks with our postdocs and talking about all the projects that they are working on towards the end of January, January 21st, I believe. Once I have that online, I will be sending that across on the email channel, on the newsletter list. So if you haven't already subscribed to the newsletter, here is your chance to scan the QR code and get on there. And there, not only will you get webinars, but jobs that are posted. We put out regularly funding opportunities, news across the Southeast, you name it. We have a really extensive newsletter that covers a lot of what's happening in the Southeast when it comes to climate adaptation. So again, Haley, one more time, thank you so much for sharing your expertise today and a wonderful talk. Everybody, I hope you have a really, really great break. Take some time to rest if you can over this break, and we'll see you again come January. Thanks so much, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks, Haley.